Hello, I'm Joshua Rutherford, intern at the Emil H. Mathis Art Gallery and graduate teaching assistant in the Department of Art History at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I'm excited to have the opportunity to present an object from the university collection today. And anyone who's been behind the scenes at the Mathis Gallery is likely at least a little bit familiar with the object I've selected for today's art exposé. Lester Johnson's Five Men in Silhouette from 1964 is a large canvas with oil expressively layered over the surface. Johnson painted this piece while spending a summer as the artist in residence and teaching painting to students at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in 1964. He donated it to the university before his departure. After his residency in Milwaukee, Lester Johnson became a professor of painting at Yale University and taught there until the late 1980s. He was born in Minneapolis in 1919. Lester Johnson grew up in the Midwest, though. He studied painting at the University of Minnesota, the St. Paul School of Art, and at the Art Institute of Chicago before moving to New York in 1947. He continued to paint after retiring from teaching, and his work is featured in the permanent collection of many prestigious art institutions. His paintings have been exhibited alongside the work of abstract expressionists at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, and the Art Institute of Chicago, among others. While he was living in a Soho loft in New York, Johnson became a member of the 8th Street Club, which is also known as The Club. It's a collective of artists that was founded in New York in the fall of 1949 by Philip Pavia. The club was an artist social space that was kind of birthed of necessity. While the painters of the area had grown accustomed to the bottomless coffee at the Waldorf cafeteria and spent a lot of time socializing there, the cafeteria grew frustrated with the starving artists and decided to start charging by the cup to prevent loitering. So Pavia and a group of about 20 others, which included Lester Johnson, founded the club as a space for artists to convene daily, discuss their lives and their practice together. It was a social space. Other founding members of the club included Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, and Robert Motherwell. But Lester Johnson was the only painter in the club whose work focused primarily on the human form, the human figure. The club members were not bound by a single visual style or ideology, but they each painted with a sort of distinct style, which intentionally contrasted with the trends in art at the time. They were opposed to social realism and to surrealism. They wanted to go for something more expressive than that. The painters that gathered at the club were aligned with abstract expressionism in a way, but they did not intend to be seen as a movement so much as a collective. They wanted to have a space to discuss art, drink, and defy social norms in the company of other artists and intellectuals without having any sort of binding agreement, I guess. So Pavia saw the opportunity to use the club as a venue and eventually started hosting lectures from some of New York's top artists and thinkers on Friday night, and he would just offer them a bottle of liquor in exchange for lecturing at the club, which is kind of fun. So artists that spoke at the club included Piet Mondrian, Joseph Albers, Yves Tanguy, and Marcel Duchamp. John Cage frequently spoke and attended meetings at the club, and philosopher Hannah Arendt also spoke there. Jackson Pollock was known to hang out at the club, but he was sort of less formally associated with the club because he had ongoing disputes with de Kooning. But in addition to the lectures, the club also hosted like philosophical discussion groups and other events. They had some form of dancing most nights. They studied things like existentialism, philosophy, phenomenology, Gestalt psychology, music composition. They were interested in the connections between philosophy and art and life. As more and more artists sort of adopted the idea that everyone could be an artist, philosophy and music were a means of connecting the world of fine art with the world of daily life. So the club really encouraged alternate uses of media, and Johnson did as well, even outside his work with the club. I found it cool that Johnson performed in some of Alan Caprow's early happenings, independently of the club, in the early 1950s. So there was a kind of tight-knit network of artists in New York that was going on at this time. Very interesting. because Pollock was championed by Clement Greenberg and de Kooning by Harold Rosenberg, the two kind of big art critics of the time, they were seen as stylistically pitted against each other, and as I mentioned earlier, they had a bit of a rivalry as a result of this. But the club was still a safe space for artists to socialize free from the anxieties of the outside world, and Pavia developed it into a space where artists could understand the political and cultural environment through rigorous discussion, debate, and argument. He wanted people to talk and relate about ideas, about their context with the world, which is really cool. So we'll discuss some more of the ideological influences of the club and Johnson's work a little later in this presentation, but for now, I do want to draw attention to two key details from his biography. Lester Johnson is usually considered an abstract expressionist painter, but he was more associated with Willem de Kooning's work than with Pollock's, which is significant. Also, Johnson was part of a community of artists that was interested in understanding the social, political, and cultural climate of the mid-20th century and exploring how different media and arts could help recreate relations from society. So, let's look at this painting a little bit more. This painting's huge. It's 52 by 68 inches, around there. Textured white background kind of contrasts sharply with the figures in a way that it kind of makes them appear as though they're in motion. The perspective's a little bit off. The darkness of the figures makes this even more difficult to sort of distinguish their placement in the composition. The figures are looking at us dead on, but the arrangement's kind of got this illusory sense of perspective. Are they walking with 3 men in the front row and 2 men behind them, or are they kind of staggered like they're walking down the street in a crowd? The bodies are rendered dark. There's not really a merger between the bodies. It's this depth of black in the visual field in the bottom that enhances this sense of perspective. The faces are kind of rendered in a slightly greenish hue. There's a little blue in certain spots of the canvas, but that's the only real color that's coming through. And the kind of gaze, they're not really, I don't feel like they're looking at me so much as I feel like they're, looking through me. They're absorbed in a different trajectory. I feel like there's a sort of alienation between them even. They don't seem to be looking at each other. Their pupils are facing towards the audience, not towards one another. But despite the fact that they're not making any eye contact with one another, they're still bound together through Johnson's composition, which is kind of cool. The weight of the bottom half of the canvas, it just obscures the boundaries of the figures, but it also obscures the boundaries of the canvas. The figures kind of go over the edge of the canvas, and we don't know where one ends and another begins. So, what was Johnson trying to capture here? And how does Johnson's use of figuration contrast and complement with the style of these other abstract expressionist artists? And how did Johnson's ideological community affect his approach to the subject of the human figure? So these are some of the questions that I'm going to explore in the rest of this presentation. So moving on, let's look at Johnson's slightly earlier work. His representation of the human face, which he considered the quote-unquote plastic symbol of the body, was his first stylistic development, according to most historians. His earlier works, like the example on the left from the Art Institute of Chicago and the example of the right from the Mathis collection, usually focused on a single figure. The outline of the face was rendered through the direct manipulation of paint on canvas or paper in these examples. And his suggestion is that the face is the plastic symbol of the body, is kind of a mirror to a lot of philosophy on relationality and exteriority that was emerging in the post-World War II ethical philosophy. We can see this reflected in statements like this one from Emmanuel Levinas, who asserted that the face is present in its refusal to be contained. It is neither seen nor touched, for in visual and tactile sensation, the identity of the eye envelops the alterity of the object, which becomes precisely a content. What Levinas was suggesting, and this was extended by a number of philosophers in the late 50s and early 60s, is that the face represents a common ground for all humanity. There's a We might not be able to understand one another in terms of culture or language, but there's something in the face that we can universally recognize emotion in the expression of another's face. And from this recognition, we should be able to find some sense of compassion to help avoid atrocities such as happened during World War II, which is why this was inspired during that time. So in manipulating the paint directly onto the canvas here, Johnson's sort of forming a face that bears this generic semblance of expression, but it's in a way that de-emphasizes individuality, where more realistic work like social realism might have tried to emphasize the individual character. By reducing the face to its most essential signifiers, Johnson is trying to focus more on the relationality between expression and bodies in space. So this is something that's going to become a little more clear when we start to look at these examples. 5-minute silhouette and 3 Bowery figures here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art are both sort of these grouping compositions, which art historian Judith Stein has suggested is more definitive of Johnson's work from the mid-60s to the late 80s, in which the artist was more engaged by the activities of the street than the individual persona or the individual figure. She quotes Johnson describing his intentions as saying, quote, "In my painting, I was working for forms that were alive, that moved across the canvas and never set, that had some noise, chaos, and order of the city." Stein goes on to suggest that Johnson captured the scene of the New York streets, attempting to capture the motion embodied in the behavior of his subjects, who refuse to be regulated by the frame. Within the context of the artist himself and Stein's poetic analysis of his work, we can start to understand what Johnson was trying to capture in his unique use of perspective. Being fascinated by the order and chaos of the street, Johnson chose to represent the movement of bodies through space and the movement between bodies. He wanted to capture this notion of individuals walking in groups along distinct individual trajectories. It's no doubt that Johnson intended to capture the sense of plurality and universality amidst this alienation in New York, constantly surrounded by strangers in such a populous landscape, but remaining disconnected from others. His use of space here disembodies the subject from the landscape, as life in a big city can do. He emphasizes the relation between these 5 separate bodies in motion, bound together only by their shared space and movement. Street scenes remained a constant for Johnson, as Stein suggested, even in his later work, like this example on the right from the Mathis collection, street scene with man and woman. The bodies are kind of not responsive to the borders of each other. They're overflowing onto each other's bodies. The contours of the lines kind of overflow the edge of the canvas. So we can see how Johnson favored close groupings and liked to challenge the viewer's conception of pictorial space by having his subjects encroach on the boundaries of the frame. While his earlier examples from the Mathis collection, like the individual figures that we looked at, can help us better understand 5-minute silhouette, as this later example can as well, I believe that the style of composition used in 5-minute silhouette is kind of Johnson's peak in the abstract expressionist style, and can really help us understand how abstract expressionists were responding to the idea of relationality. So in consideration of the philosophical interests of the club and the ongoing conversations regarding different styles of abstract expressionism, not only was Johnson making his intervention on the alienation of individualism, but his painting can also help us better understand the connection and the ideological differences between Pollock and de Kooning's styles. The textbook narrative of abstract expressionism generally focuses heavily on Jackson Pollock, action painting, and Greenberg's conception of a new avant-garde whose understanding of the relationship between artist and materiality had been violently changed along with the nature of modern warfare, following the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As Valerie Hellenstein, a curator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has suggested, The period in which the club was active, though, also coincided with the emergence of Cold War politics. So, in addition to this sort of sense of destruction, there was also a political economy in which rugged individualism was championed, and individual values were to be modeled on self-sufficiency. This was being showcased on the global stage to show how Americans were able to live these private lives as individuals, and attempts to undermine communist revolutions. This all ties in with McCarthyism and all of that. So amidst this kind of bifurcated affective landscape torn between the violence of World War II and the individualization of the Cold War, Hellenstein suggests that the artists of the club were focused on forms of philosophy which could provide some sense of universal understanding of humanity. While the group was comprised of many World War II veterans, and they all stood in opposition to communism, they were still interested in the notion of collectivity and wanted to study concepts like Bergson's vitalism, Heidegger's Dasein, and Gestalt psychology to kind of understand the relationship between violence and materiality in modern society. So these artists explored the ways that human bodies are connected through the senses rather than through language. And de Kooning and the artists in the club kind of tried to steer away from violence and focus more on this sensory aspect. So de Kooning's vibrant paintings are like this example excavation from the Art Institute. They have these subtle hues of color that are mixed into these dense fields of line work and negative space, but they allude to this interconnected of the sensual and the experience of the sublime. So de Kooning is trying to represent some of the relationality between the senses and bodies and how sensory movement might be depicted in pictorial form. But Johnson is trying to capture something different. So how was Johnson capturing the sort of relationality of being in his work? So let's stick with let's return one more time to Judith Stein's essay. In the end of her essay, she concludes with this line: "As a painter and as a teacher, Lester Johnson embodies the energy which remains his underlying theme. By universalizing the human form, Johnson quietly asserts the commonality of human experience, the likeness of things unlike," quote. Remembering the intention of capturing the motion of bodies moving in the street, we can start to understand Johnson's painting as a sort of mediation on relationality. So while these bodies, alike in their common humanity but separate in their individual trajectories, they move together as a mass here. They're seemingly ambivalent towards one another. There's simultaneously a group and, several individuals. Johnson's painting captures this social tendency towards self-alienation, but I think his intention was in capturing the aspect of social relations and to draw attention to it. He was interested in the Cold War economy. He was interested in the notion of individuality, but he was equally interested in the notion of collectivity. He wanted to kind of look at what's missing in relational behaviors and see how we might be able to recognize that and change that. So while Pollock's work reflected on the violence and destruction of materiality, and de Kooning's paintings reflected on the sort of interconnectedness of sensory experience, Johnson's sort of figurative expressionist style can help us connect the abstraction of sensory materiality with this individualism of the Cold War politics. His emphasis on relationality in this context serves as a critique of the politics of individualism, arguing instead for a shared understanding of how human behaviors are being altered by social and political contexts in modernity. So how did the collectivity of the club affect the style of participating artists? What was the motive behind the collective? Let's return one more time to Valerie Hellenstein's essay, in which she suggests that the club operated as a form of anarchist mutual aid. That while there was no formal agreement binding them to the movement, the members recognized their own alienation from others and wanted to come together to find some sort of communitarian kinship, as Hellenstein calls it. Effectively, the members of the club, while ideologically opposed in many respects, and even straight up argumentative in many respects, They felt the need to come together, support one another, and care for each other. The collectivity was born out of a need for compassion for the individuals that perhaps didn't have families or perhaps lacked a network of understanding and a network of support. They wanted to find a way of supporting one another in such an individualizing economy. So while the Greenbergian aspect of abstract expressionism focused on the heroic individual, in line with the representation of America that was projected throughout the Cold War, we can see that there was a sense of collectivity that helped the club develop as a unique community focused on mutuality instead. By establishing a collective which helped member artists explore the political and cultural landscape through new theoretical concepts, the club developed into a sort of model for a new collectivity in the arts, which understood compassion and care as essential to the creative process. While desiring to remain free from the restrictions of a stylistic movement, the members of the club supported one another's continued development as artists and sort of developed the framework for each other to create this socially focused work. Rather than being focused on the object, as Greenberg was, the ideological foundations of the club were more interested in underscoring the shared nature of sensual and relational aspects of humanity, and the collective effort to better understand and reflect the social and political consciousness of the mid-20th century in their work can be seen in the start of this period. So while the artists in the club were not concerned with guaranteeing social change, they mark a departure from the more figurative compositions in which the representational avoids the political. These are trying to broach the political. They're trying to find a way to approach the political. The artists of the club built a shared ideological network and devised new ways of presenting contemporary social issues in their compositions, and helped the artists develop a theoretical framework that could help them better represent themselves to critics. So through his involvement with the club, Johnson found a way that he could represent the shared human nature that Cold War politics had suppressed, but because of his donation to the university, I've also had the honor of presenting this with you today. So thank you very much for your time.